Golden Blooded back with another video just for you, the college football fans. So if you are a college football fan, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. Look, it's a long off season, but I'm here to get you through it. We also have a great Patreon page. We're putting a lot of time and effort into that, and I call my Patreons the shot callers. I let them decide who I do previews and predictions on first. We also have a great website designed by Joey Foster and great writers led by head writer Michael Walker. If y'all have been around Golden Blooded for a while, you know for a fact that I love talking about conference realignment. Well, guess what? I'm going to talk about it again today. And today I want to talk about the ACC survival. How does the ACC survive going forward? Because the ACC is one of the conferences that's at risk for the Power 5 of being picked apart or being irrelevant. The ACC has more options than people realize. So I want to go through those options real quick and get y'all's opinion on it and see which option is the best option for the ACC. But the first thing on the docket is keeping some teams. What are the teams that the ACC must keep in order to stay relevant and not be picked apart? I think there's three names: Clemson, Florida State, and Miami. I think those are your three biggest brands, and Clemson is your most successful program. So the ACC has to keep those names in the ACC if they want to survive. Now, there's other decent names that the ACC could actually afford to lose. Now, would they really want to lose them? No, but they would be okay if they did. And that would be North Carolina, Virginia Tech, Virginia, and NC State. And the Big Ten has been interested in all four of those teams. Now, does the ACC want to lose those four teams? Absolutely not. That would definitely hurt the ACC, but it wouldn't be a make or break situation. In fact, it wouldn't be as big of a hit as what the SEC did to the Big 12 in taking Oklahoma and Texas. They can afford those losses even though they don't want those losses. The losses they can't afford: Clemson, Florida State, Miami. Those are your biggest money makers, your biggest brands, and Clemson is your most successful brand. Literally the only representative in the college football playoff. Well, not the only brand. There was Florida State about 10 years ago, but they've become irrelevant. But they're still on the list because they're a big brand and they make a lot of money. Now, in order for the ACC to survive, they're going to have to add some teams, right? Well, they already missed out on Cincinnati, Houston, and UCF from the AAC. Those were the best available group of 5 brands, and they went to the Big 12. So that's off the list. So what are some other options that the ACC can go after? Well, first of all, they're not getting any teams from the SEC. That's not going to happen. They're also not going to get any teams from the Big Ten. In fact, they've already lost teams to the Big Ten. So that's definitely not happening. And now with Cincinnati, Houston, and UCF off the board, are there any names in the group of 5 that could help the ACC? I think there are. I really do. But only if they do it the right way. So let's talk about those teams real quick. Out of the Sunbelt, are there any teams out of the Sunbelt that would actually help the ACC? I think there are, especially if you lose a North Carolina, a Virginia Tech, or Virginia, or NC State. I don't think it levels it out completely, but it definitely helps. So out of the Sunbelt, I think Appalachian State and Louisiana would be the only 2 teams that could help make up for the loss of those bigger brands. Now, I'm not saying that they would 100% even it out. No, I'm just saying they would help stop the bleeding. I think Appalachian State's brand is going higher and higher. They are in the state of North Carolina, so geography-wise, it makes sense. And for Louisiana, it would actually stretch the footprint of the ACC just a little bit. And Louisiana has been pretty stinking good in the Sunbelt recently. And no, I'm not going to suggest Coastal Carolina. Yes, they've had success, but Coastal Carolina's brand is not big at all. I know geographically it would make sense for Coastal Carolina to be in the ACC, but that's about it. They bring nothing to the table for the ACC. There are 2 teams in the AAC that could still possibly help the ACC. One is East Carolina, the other is Memphis. I think Memphis could actually help the ACC. They're a pretty decent brand and they have a big backing by FedEx. Now, for East Carolina, they would make perfect sense geographically, and if North Carolina and or NC State were to be taken by the Big Ten, it would help lessen the sting of that. It wouldn't completely make up for it, but it would lessen the sting. And I think East Carolina's brand is better than people realize. This one might surprise you as well. There are some teams out of the current Conference USA that I think would help benefit the ACC if they were to get them, if they did it the right way. I'm talking about Marshall, UAB, and FAU. Now, for UAB, their brand's getting better and better, and it would give the ACC a footprint in the state of Alabama. I also think FAU has a big enough brand to where they would fit into the ACC, but I don't know if Florida State or Miami would allow that. So that's the only hiccup for FAU. And I would say if the ACC brought in West Virginia, only then would it make sense to bring in Marshall. Marshall's not a big brand in and of itself to bring by themselves or with the lower brand, but if you bring in West Virginia, that actually would make sense to bring in Marshall. You'd have the entire state of West Virginia locked down, and Marshall claims to be a rival of West Virginia, but let's face it, it's really not a rivalry. It's really more like a big brother versus little brother type of situation. West Virginia is 12-0 all-time against Marshall in football. Now, what about independents? Well, there's UConn. UConn is a tricky situation. UConn actually used to be real relevant. They have a 40,000-seat stadium, but recently their football program is basically a wasteland, so I don't think UConn would help the ACC at all. But the ACC would help UConn if they were to join the ACC. Would the ACC be willing to take a risk on UConn, knowing what they could be because of their past, or would the ACC think that UConn is too far gone and they would not be willing to take that risk? That is definitely a risk-reward situation that you'd have to sit down and think about. And all that's football related, but the thing that's going for UConn as far as joining the ACC is their basketball brand. UConn has a very strong basketball brand. So if the ACC brought in UConn and football didn't work out, that could be another Duke, because Duke's been bad in football but great in basketball. So it would definitely give the ACC something to think about. And when you get a minute, go check out my friends over at the West Virginia Webcast. I did a live show with them about a week ago. It was a great time. They're great guys. And they cover all things West Virginia, not just West Virginia football or West Virginia sports. They cover the entire state of West Virginia. So if you're a West Virginia native or a West Virginia fan, you definitely should check it out. But if you're not and you're curious about the state of West Virginia, you should definitely go give those guys a watch. They have a lot of great content over there. The other independent would be Army. I think Army is a possibility. Geographically, they would make sense. I do think they bring money to the table, and it would bring a U.S. military academy into the ACC. That's never a bad thing. And then there's Notre Dame. Yes, the ACC definitely needs to lock in Notre Dame. I mean, that's a big deal for the ACC. I mean, yes, Notre Dame plays an ACC schedule, but they're not a full-time member in college football, except for that 1 year in 2020. And you already know I'm going to talk about it. West Virginia from the Big 12. Hey, it makes too much sense. West Virginia has built-in rivalries. I'm talking about Virginia Tech, Pitt, Syracuse, Boston College, Louisville, and Miami. Whether you agree with me or not, the fact of the matter is West Virginia would bring money to the ACC, and they would definitely bring eyeballs. I mean, look at the West Virginia-Virginia Tech game from last year. They had the highest ratings out of any game in that noon slate. In fact, I thought that game should have been a 7 o'clock kickoff, but instead it was a noon kickoff, still blasted every other noon kickoff. So that proves right off the bat that West Virginia would bring eyeballs. Not just from West Virginia, but they would bring eyeballs from the teams that they would play. Virginia Tech fans want to watch that West Virginia-Virginia Tech game more than like a Virginia Tech, NC State game, Virginia Tech, Wake Forest game. Basically, 90% of the ACC Virginia Tech fans would rather see West Virginia versus Virginia Tech. In fact, it might be 100%. They might rather see that game more than any other game in the ACC. Same thing goes for Pitt fans. I mean, we're going to see the backyard brawl this year. It's going to do big numbers for that Thursday night. So every time West Virginia plays an ACC team, that will prove the point that West Virginia will bring money to the ACC and will bring eyeballs, not just from our fan base, but from the fan bases that we're going to play. And you can't go by the population of the state of West Virginia. There is West Virginia alumni all over the country. There is West Virginia fans all over the country. In fact, here in the upstate of South Carolina, every time there's a watch party at a local bar or whatever you want to call it, they have what you call a main room, and it goes to the fan base that brings the most fans. And it's always between West Virginia and Ohio State. So we go head to head with one of the biggest fan bases in the nation, and we've won against them to get that main room. I'm telling you, West Virginia fans are all over the country. If you start opening your eyeballs and start actually looking for the Flying WV, you'll see there's more out there than you realize. So yes, bringing West Virginia would make total sense, probably the most sense out of any of these candidates. And the perfect scenario would be getting West Virginia and Notre Dame. But here's the thing, Jim Phillips is petitioning the NCAA to do away with divisions in order for a conference that has 12 plus members to have a conference championship. So they wouldn't necessarily have to bring in Notre Dame with West Virginia if that goes through. And that's getting a lot of backing from all the conferences, not just from the ACC. At first it was just the ACC. Now everybody else is coming aboard. So there's a lot of pressure on the NCAA to do away with that ridiculous rule. And really, if you think about it, it makes no sense. Why was that rule made? Why do you have to have divisions to have a conference championship? That conference has 12 or more members. It doesn't make sense, no matter how you spin it. So the ACC must keep Clemson, Florida State, and Miami. That's the first thing right off the bat. If that doesn't happen, none of this other stuff that I talked about would help at all. So they have to keep those three. And of the options that I gave, Notre Dame and West Virginia would be the biggest options. But doing away with the divisions conference rule, you wouldn't necessarily have to bring in Notre Dame. And trust me, just bringing in West Virginia would help the ACC tremendously. Alright, so y'all let me know in the comments section what you think about my opinion on the ACC and everything it needs to do in order to survive, including keeping those 3 brands and the teams they could bring in to help build the ACC brand. I already know there's going to be a lot of back and forth on this one. That's all I got for you for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on my next show.